What's the first thing you think of when you hear the word desert? It's the Sahara Desert that immediately springs to mind, right? After all, the Sahara is one of the world's largest deserts, but most well-known desert, covering darn near the entire top third of the continent of Africa. The thought is that the entire thing is filled with massive sand dunes, teams of camels making long, difficult treks, and thousands of square miles of pretty much nothing except for that sand, the wind, and incredibly inhospitable conditions. And well, that's sort of right, in places at least. But the entire Sahara Desert is not exactly like the picture that probably springs into your head. In reality, this ancient desert has quite a few fascinating tidbits about it that you wouldn't expect. In this list, we'll take a look at 10 of those facts. Here's a rundown of 10 amazing and unexpected pieces of information about the Sahara Desert that most people don't know. It really is massive. We weren't kidding up top when we said the Sahara Desert covered darn near the entire top third of the continent of Africa. Our comment there was actually right on point, because the Sahara covers exactly 31% of the African continent. In total, the Sahara is spread out over an area of about 3.5 million square miles. At its widest point from north to south, the Sahara runs more than 1,100 miles in length, and widthwise, from east to west, it covers roughly 3,000 miles. So, when overlaid above the contiguous United States, the Sahara Desert nearly matches it in greatest north-south distance and actually exceeds its midpoint east to west. That's a huge desert. It's not just the square mileage itself that gives pause either. The largest sand dunes within the western Sahara Desert stretch high up into the sky as well. The biggest ones are regularly over 500 feet tall, with the very tallest hopping 600 feet. That's quite a climb for any man or beast unlucky enough to be caught in the middle of that sandy situation. It isn't all sand. It's natural to think that the Sahara Desert is just one big, long stretch of sand dunes. But that actually couldn't be further from the truth. In reality, the sand seas that you think of when the stereotype of the Sahara Desert comes to mind are actually only part of a very small portion of the area. These sand seas, which are called ergs by scientists, make up a big chunk of the far western reaches of the desert, mostly in western Sahara, Morocco, Mauritania, and the far western part of Algeria. When you move east through the Sahara Desert, you actually find quite a few different habitats beyond giant sand dunes. There are stone plateaus known as hamadas across much of the Sahara eastward, as well as gravel plains known as regs, countless dried-up lakes, some deep, desolate valleys, and even areas with major salt flats. And there are mountains. The Sahara Desert is ringed in nearly every direction by various mountain ranges. In northern Niger, the Air Mountains pop up in the middle of the desert. In southern Algeria, the Hogga Range does too. Chad and Libya share the Tibesti Range, nearly smack dab in the center of the desert. Egypt and Sudan have the Red Sea Hills that make up part of the border between those two nations. The Eye of the Sahara, a geological formation known as the Richat structure, is one of the most unique aspects of the Sahara Desert, and scientists aren't entirely sure what it is. Located in a rural part of Mauritania, the Richat structure is a natural dome that is made up of many layers of sedimentary rock. This rock is laid out in perfect circles, giving the area the look of an eye when viewed from high above the ground. Scientists first discovered the region in the 1930s and began studying it to see what it was all about. At first, they believed a meteor crashing into the Earth millions of years ago had likely caused the circular look to the land. But lately, that hypothesis has come under question. In the 2000s, evidence proved that it was definitely not a meteor that created the Eye of the Sahara. But geologists and alike still aren't exactly sure why it is there. Some say hydrothermal waters built up in that area in the past and caused the unique rock formations and sedimentary baking. The Sahara is half the story. At the bottom of the Sahara Desert, lining it along the southern edge in nations like Burkina Faso, South Sudan, Chad, Nigeria, and Mali is something called the Sahel. Yes, the word is very similar to Sahara, and we'll get to that in a second. But the Sahel is its own fascinating natural ecosystem that doesn't get nearly as much attention as the Sahara does, even though it should. The Sahel is a tropical savanna grassland that can get very wet, green, and lively during the rainy season, and very dry and desolate during times of drought. Just like the Sahara, the Sahel stretches nearly coast to coast across Africa and serves as the border region between the harshest climates of the Sahara and the far more tropical reaches of the continent as it moves south toward the equator. In fact, the name Sahel is the Arabic word for coast or shore. That's a purposeful choice. Not because the Sahel touches the coast. Only very small portions of it actually reach the Atlantic Ocean and or Red Sea, but because the Sahel functions essentially as the shore of the Sahara Desert as it meets the rest of civilization to its south. Still, other linguists note that the Arabic word sol, which means plain, is the root for the term Sahel, a really old mummy. The oldest mummy in the world was found in the Sahara Desert and had nothing to do with ancient Egyptian civilization. Commonly called the Tashwinat mummy, this mummified body of a young child was found by an Italian archaeologist and professor named Fabrizio Mori at the Yuan Muhajeg in Libya way back in 1958. At that site, the mummy discovered was that of a 2- or 3-year-old boy who had been wrapped carefully in leaves and then tightly wound in antelope skin. His organs had been removed prior to his burial in the desert too, and primitive preservatives were found to have been injected into his body in order to maintain it as best they could at the time. Considering the mummy was found literally thousands of years later, it appears those ancient desert dwellers did a pretty good job in that regard. Carbon dating puts the body at having passed away right around the year 3000 BC. Desert civilizations flourished. While the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans were dominating the European area in terms of either land control or cultural capital in their respective reigns, they weren't the only civilizations flourishing in the hemisphere. Down south of the Mediterranean, right smack dab in the middle of the Sahara Desert, several notable ancient civilizations rose up and prospered before dying out and being subsumed into other cultures. Chief among these was a group of people known as the Garamantes. These people rose up to power in what is now known as Libya in about 500 BC and controlled the region for the next 1,000 years. They survived in the middle of the desert by digging deep wells down into the earth. There they could get water for their fields, allowing crops to grow and life to survive and then thrive in what otherwise should have been an extremely inhospitable place. Interestingly, both the Greeks and the Romans thought very little of the Garamantes during their run in the Sahara, and the Romans even conquered them at one point. The Garamantes' neighbors to the north believed these desert people to be uncivilized nomads and not worthy of serious consideration as potential allies or threats.